starting off with the land acknowledgement and sending love out to the Ohlone and Pomo and Miwok lands that you guys are all on. I'm presenting today from the traditional unceded territory and sacred homelands of the Massachusetts, Wampanoag, Nipmuc, and Abenaki peoples. MIT also, as an institution that I wrote this thesis for, has profited from the sale of federal land stolen from 82 tribes through the Morrill Act, including the Tachi Yokut tribe, who I worked with for this thesis. They're the first people among the many first people of the Tulare Lake region. And so I wanted to acknowledge the enduring relationship that exists between Indigenous peoples and their homelands, as well as the painful and ongoing legacy of genocide and dispossession and colonialism, which I am an academic institution are implicated in, and offer respect to the elders, past, present, and future, the lands that I occupy, and affirm my intention to be a good guest while I'm here. The image is a very cool project that the city of Cambridge is doing through their participatory budgeting process, which is a great example, I think, of how we can incorporate acknowledgements of Indigenous enduring relationships and ongoing presence in their homelands by incorporating street signage, place names, and reminders that folks are still here. This was led by a woman of Massachusetts descent. So the agenda for the talk today is that roughly about 45 minutes with 15 minutes for questions after that. So an introduction and overview, some environmental and historical context, and then about 20 minutes more on the framing of the planning question and some of the solutions that I ended up proposing. If anyone has to drop off, no worries. Thank you for joining. So kicking things off, the Tulare Lake Basin is a 22,000 square mile region defined by its hydrological geography. It's home to 2.4 million people and 3 of the 4 top earning agricultural counties in the United States. Before 2023, many people who live in this region or who interact with it via the highway, I-5 shown here, or the variety of products at supermarkets around the world that have interacted with the land, water, and labor of this region, did not know the name of the water body that anchors this watershed, shown in this little key map down here at the southern end of the southern end of the Central Valley. Yet in early maps of the area that would become California, a broad, shallow lake, variably labeled Laguna de los Tulares, Lake of the Tule Reeds, or Laguna de Tachi, Lake of the Tachi people, is one of the most prominent geographic features in the nation state. The Tachi, a tribe of Yokuts Native Americans, the region's first people, call the lake Pa'ashi. Pa'ashi means big water, and it is the same word that the tribe uses for the Pacific Ocean, which starts to put the human scale of the lake into perspective. I first learned about the lake at a rest stop in Kettleman City on a drive for work, actually, back from San Francisco from Oceanside in 2021, so a few years back. The state was in the middle of a drought, and yet there in the shoreline, or yet there in the topography, was the shoreline of a big, shallow sea. The shape of the mountains seemed to shift when my dad told me about this lake, becoming more obviously legible as having been carved by big rivers running to the valley floor, where they pooled together in a lake that both was and wasn't present. I didn't know that I was standing in the same spot that Walter Cameron, Kings County real estate and oil lands developer, had stood with his father and a friend in 1910 to watch Halley's Comet make its periodic return back to the Earth's sky. Those men back then had marveled at the celestial body's reflection on the surface of Pa'ashi, at that time quite an inland lake. I didn't yet know the details of the indigenous history here either, and that the Kettleman City rest stop was likely part of the route that the Yokuts were made to walk around the same time that Cameron was a boy, when they were evicted from one reservation to another, as resources were discovered that settlers sought to claim: soil, oil, groundwater. To the Yokuts standing here at the turn of the century, Cameron's inland lake would have seemed quite small. For Pa'ashi had begun to shrink in response to the valley's intensive irrigated agricultural development along the floodplains of the Sierra's mighty rivers, the Kings, the Kaweah, the Tule, and the Kern. Pa'ashi, the basin's lake, its rivers, floodplains, groundwater aquifers, and springs, is central to understanding the history, spirit, and ecology of the Tulare Lake Basin. Yet in that dry year, when I first learned some of its story, the lake was hidden in plain sight on the land. It took my dad telling me where to see it, where to look for me to be able to see it. And certainly it wasn't celebrated at the rest stop even though that overlook would be the perfect place for an informational sign or a plaque, maybe even a trail that led down to the hills, from the hills to the old lake shoreline, where eager travelers and truck drivers could stretch their legs. It's difficult to find reference to the lake in the built environment or the culture of the towns that are around and in the lake bed, such as Corcoran, shown above, which is a company town founded by California's largest cotton grower. Sign does not reference that it was underwater about 100 years ago. So one of the things that I struggled with throughout the thesis process was that of naming and of descriptions. How do you write about something that both is and isn't present? The lake isn't there, but the water is, and the transpiration of the crops, the irrigation infrastructure that crisscrosses the lake bed. Birds still stop here along the Pacific Flyway. Native food plants grow when it's a wet year and there's enough fog. And of course, the Yokuts still live here as well. And so in my research, that was something that I kept coming up against. And one of the concepts that I found really helpful was one that sociologists and historians use to describe the production of doubt and uncertainty, called agnotology, kind of the production of ignorance. It is the argument in one of the papers that I read said that, the physical, political, and cultural narratives about the Tulare Lake Basin have produced this fundamental ecological and historical ignorance of place. So the valley is known as a flat and dry world covered by agriculture and oil fields. Water is scarce. What does flow makes people sick because it's polluted. And the heritage of the watershed is a dynamic ecosystem of microclimates and biodiversity, rich, continuous indigenous history, all of which was connected by water, is minimized along with the lake because that knowledge does not serve the dominant economic interests of cheap water, labor that's willing to live here, and therefore cheap commodity food. Catching my breath. So to begin to see the lake clearly, it's helpful to understand the landscape as one of constant flux. So on an annual cycle, over 2.7 million acres of farmland are planted and harvested here. The dominant crops have changed over the decades, as has the racial makeup of the people who work on the fields. And then there's the water, which is not a constant thing, of course, but a dynamic cycle. It's historically defined by these pendulum swings, shown on the graph below, between wet and dry periods, defined by the atmospheric rivers that are carried across the Pacific. In big water years, spring and summer snowmelt brings water rushing down the rivers of the Sierra Nevada until eventually they meet up at the endpoint, the watershed, which is the lake bed of Tulare Lake. That's the bottom where it all collects, and it's a closed watershed that is the only place it would have gathered historically. And so even with all the barriers that have been added to the lake's rivers, another point of interest and maybe irony is that the lake has consistently and routinely returned to the lake bed since it first vanished about 125 years ago. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers assessed that the likelihood of its waters entering the lake bed in a given year was about 1 in 3. Big water years, when the lake appears in a more substantial way, come about every 20 years, shown in these darker blue images on the graph above. And so it's within a human generation, it's within a general plan, but it's not a time frame that most people have wrapped their heads around easily. Nevertheless, it's ironic that every time the lake comes back, it's treated by the media as sort of a novel occurrence. This is just different perspectives. You can see the flood patterns overlaid on top of each other, and also another key map of the area that we're talking about. So here's a photo of the lake, or photos of the lakes in the 1910s. Again in the 1930s, 1960s, 1990s, and then again in 2023 and 2024. And so this is my entry point into the thesis. The photo on the left, I was driving my husband from finishing grad school off to live with me in Boston, and we drove through here because we had read that the lake was back. And I thought, this is really interesting. I would really like to dig into this further. And so I started monitoring the media and decided this was going to be my planning thesis topic. And a lot of those questions about narrative really came through in those articles that I was reading. First question being a lot of people didn't know, what is this lake? People who lived there. Why is there water here all of a sudden? What is happening with these floods? And questions about how you call the lake, like if it's a lake but it's not a lake, is it a ghost lake or a zombie lake or a phantom lake? It's kind of framing it as something that is dead that has come back. A lot of the narrative focused on the impacts of the agricultural economy, agricultural losses. Some covered that there were disproportionate risks that impacted vulnerable populations. In Corcoran, the city that was under the lake bed's floodline, there's a large state prison. And so it was unclear if there's going to be an evacuation or not, if that was going to be something that was needed. Question about public process and public input. Governor Newsom waived CEQA requirements. And before he did so, a lot of farmers tried to patch up the damage to their lands kind of on their own. One man ran a truck through a levee as his way of stopping the water from hitting his field. Some articles also asked, climate change is happening. This is Mother Nature that's talking to us. Is it time for a new ecological paradigm where we have a lake here, if that can help mitigate some of these flood impacts? Questions about, can you even access the water? Because a lot of this is large farm fields. But on the other hand, there's the navigable waters doctrine. So kayakers also brought their kayaks out and they're like, no, I think we're allowed to be here. And then finally, unlike other times when the lake has come back, the tribe went on record as well. And so we heard them saying, we'd like to see this water be protected. Yeah, just some photos showing that the access was very limited. So framing the thesis, I think what I got into was the California Water Plan update from 2023, which guides a lot of the water policy in the state, describes the Tulare Lake Basin as facing critical water insecurity, diminished water quality. There's no access to recreational waters. There's very limited access for tribal cultural purposes. And there's a lack of security for future occupancy in the region. Very dire prognostics. These are also all risks that climate change exacerbates. And so while attempts have been made in kind of bits and pieces from different governments, they're curtailed both physically and politically by the fragmented nature of the governance out there, as well as kind of the insatiable quality of commercial agriculture, which is the main landowner, the main representatives in local government and water boards, and now with a sympathetic federal government. Big agriculture was a major donor to the Trump administration, is unlikely to be checked from a federal level as well. Meanwhile, most of this region is identified as an SB 35 or S 535 disadvantaged community. There are very limited economic opportunities out there. And only about 53% of people live within a half mile of a park. And yet, once in a generation, the lake comes back, and as it reclaims its territory and kind of transforms the valley, an Overton window, so when normally controversial policy becomes more acceptable, opens, and there's a chance for people to advocate for more sustainable futures environmentally out there, and make the case for change. So as I said, this is the first time that the Tachi Yokut tribe went to the media after the lake had come back. And for many tribal members, this was the first time they'd ever seen the lake. Pashi is very central to their creation story. It's in their songs. It's a big part of their culture. And so I reached out to their cultural liaison, who is my main community partner for this project, and asked him about it because I'd read this article through the Los Angeles Times. And he said, we've been saying that we were lake people for years, but no one really listened to us until the lake came back. And when the lake came back, it woke up a lot of their cultural practices and a lot of the tribe's spirit. And so when I was asking him, well, what do you guys want to see happen? One of the things that he pointed me towards was this idea that they had for what is a good planning future for this region. What about a national park as a mode of conservation? And so this is an image that they made on Instagram and shared and got some traction, saying Pashi National Park is like a pop-up national park. It's a place to gather, a place to weave, and a place to dream. This is the tribe's idea. They gave me permission to write about this. We worked together over the course of the thesis process. And that became the central question of my thesis, I think, because while this is a unique story, it shares a lot of beats with places around the country and around the world where there's indigenous displacement, degraded environmental quality, And now with climate change, we're looking for innovative solutions for how we fix those problems. So research questions were, how would the creation of a national park, would that support a just and sustainable future for the region? Kind of testing the proposal, testing the idea. How would the planning process itself for this national park really lift up Indigenous sovereignty? So how could it be designed to reaffirm the connection that Indigenous communities have to the Water-Edge-Larry Lake Basin and meaningfully incorporate Indigenous values, noting also I'm not of an Indigenous background, so also figuring out effective ways to work together. And how do narrative processes shape land use change, and how might planners employ those strategies to help communities work towards equitable climate adaptation? I went out there for a field visit. I did a lot of literature and policy review. I did some design drawings and spatial analysis, interviewed people, and got to write the document, which I tried to do pretty narratively, thinking of the audience as members of the tribe, wanted it to be like a legible, fun to read thing. Historical context, I think the themes here are like environmental valuation over time and setting up the need for repair. I called this wetlands and wastelands. I'll go up there pretty quickly. Big picture, Tachi, Tulare Lake, is the remnants of a lake from the Pleistocene that is the basis for the Sacramento, San Francisco Delta, and a lot of the water bodies there. But Tulare Lake was the one that was left behind after this water escaped and kind of made the San Francisco Bay a lot of years ago. The historic hydrology is that it was fed by these big four rivers. Wetlands were a really big important part of that. Important note also is that the lake was very shallow. So it was only about 3 to 4 feet deep in most places. There are stories and accounts of a strong wind blows and it like pushes the shoreline 10 feet over. And it was also very dynamic. So depending on the water year, it would grow or shrink. And the wetlands were a part of that climate system. It supported, the ecosystem that I'm showing above, kind of a transect of moving from headlands. Sequoia National Park is up in the headlands or headwaters of those rivers. So running down riparian corridors through the valley, nurturing these like big grasslands and meadows, and then the wetlands and the lake ecosystem, which I mentioned before. Noting also that these animals, particularly beavers and a lot of the plant life, had pretty important ecosystem services in terms of managing groundwater levels and keeping the water moving around and keeping it clean. And these were also food sources. So this was a very abundant region, and it supported what anthropologists have called the densest population of pre-colonial Native American settlement in North America. So estimates range from like 15,000 to like 70,000 people pre-settlement, and the range is large because the data is not good. The ethnicity term the anthropologists used for the people who lived here and still do is the Yokuts. That word means people in the shared base language that the Yokuts used, noting they wouldn't have thought of themselves as one group, not like, for example, like the Navajo tribe, but rather more like the Ohlone. They lived in distinct tribes with different language groups, but they were able to communicate for trade and cultural purposes. And so that's why they were classified as one by anthropologists later on. Their lifestyle was very different than ours, but we might recognize echoes perhaps in some of the California ethos of, following the good food, following good weather. The Yokuts were not quite nomadic, but they did travel based on weather. And so like going up into the forest when it was hot, moving around to follow food sources. And this was possible because their lifestyle was, pretty portable and low carbon. These videos are showing, there's a documentary made in the 60s. Some of the tribal members who I spoke with, like their grandparents acted out this. But the Thule reeds were really important for their technology and material culture. They're cool, kind of like a cattail. They're very abundant and they can be used to make boats, to make baskets, to make homes. And so leave no trace, these decompose when they're done. And it's easy to kind of travel and fit the needs of, whatever season, when you don't have to like pack up and move your whole house that you've made with the foundation and bricks and whatnot. Also noting that the Yokuts performed a lot of landscape services. So cultural burning was a practice, but also cultivation of like oak groves was one of the legacies that they left behind. And they lived here peacefully for thousands of years. Colonization happened in kind of waves. California settlement history is unique among the United States because of the Spanish influence, and also because the conditions of California statehood. It joined the Union so late, but also pretty notably when the state was admitted to the Union, as was practice for the expanding United States at the time. Congress said, all right, surveyors go out, negotiate treaties, come back and we'll figure out, what are going to be the native lands and what are going to be the public lands for the new union. In California's case, at the two senators from California's urging, they said, don't ratify these treaties. So they were sealed actually from the public for a long time until like the 1920s. And as a result, Native people were not federally recognized, which meant that they did not have land. They did not have kind of like the legal protections that come with that. And rancherias or reservations weren't made until the 1920s. In the meantime, we have quotes of California's first governor saying there will be a war of extermination waged between the races until the Indian race becomes extinct. And so genocide is a term that like scholars have used. The state has not formally used it. Certainly a lot of the California tribes do. And so point being very violent history when Native people were at risk of militia violence, violence in general, and also because they didn't have these legal protections, were at risk of poverty and illness from newcomers' diseases. Meanwhile, during this time, the state is also passing a lot of land acts, both the state and also the federal government. So there's a period of a lot of accumulation in terms of transferring public lands, stolen indigenous lands, to the new people, with the point being that you're supposed to fund services like universities. That's what the Moral Act was for. And so the way that worked is that the government office in Sacramento, but also sometimes in like Chicago, would say, someone comes in, they say, I'm a veteran, I would like some land. All right, here's 120 acres. Or I'm industrious, I'm really willing to work hard, I'd like to do some improvements. Here's 620 acres through the Swamp and Overflowed Land Act. And over the course of like 20 years or so, you can see in this map through parcels and everything, map surveys led to this big land transfer. And the way it happened was people were able to accumulate thousands and thousands of acres very quickly. And so you get these areas of like big private land holdings, the legacy of which is still there today. And of course, which is tied with water rights. That was kind of ironed out in the courts as these land barons took each other to court about where water was going to be. I also like this map because you can see that the lake itself is starting to be parceled up as a way of saying, hey, if this water wasn't here, what could be here? Your future homestead. The ideological underpinning of this was that, like Thomas Jefferson's Yeoman farmers, we want to settle the nation's western states with farmers. If people have land ownership is really important to this like concept of American identity. Again, noting the big caveat of like who's eligible and who's not. And the Central Valley, we'll point out, because of this hydrological history, parts of the land are very, very good for farming. There's a lot of rich organic material in the soil. The climate is good. And if you have access to water, you can grow pretty much anything. So people came out there and they thought, great, I can have my land, I'm gonna be a farmer, and I can get rich. So when California was settled, one of the first big industry booms following the gold rush was the wheat boom. So at one point, like 90% of the lake basin was planted into wheat crops. Wheat has very specific demands as a crop that they changed the land to meet. So they used a tool called like the Fresno scraper and made the land really, really flat. They tore out native grasses, a lot of which had already been disturbed by Spanish and Mexican cattle. And of course, they dug irrigation ditches. This is just kind of showing the need for commodity crops need like reliable commodity water, and that doesn't square with California's rain cycle, which brings a lot of the water in years when there is water in the winter months. And then over time, snowmelt would kind of like trickle that down through the rivers and through the groundwater and through the streams. But there would be a dry summer period before that came back. Irrigation is supposed to smooth that. So the townspeople and the landowners pretty intentionally went about then getting themselves irrigation water, which could also be phrased as draining the lake. So they passed public bonds to build infrastructure. They ran political campaigns, which were supported by media articles, like travel accounts and newspaper things describing, this lake that shouldn't be there. It's poisonous. It's swamp-like. It's malaria-ridden. It's not productive. They raised private capital, and the whole field of hydrological engineering kind of comes out of this time period premised on the idea that something is wrong with the environment. Something is wrong with the natural hydrology and it needs to be fixed. So these are just some images of that happening as it does. And so the lake started to shrink. Like I mentioned earlier, it got smaller. This is maybe around the time of that comment. And just 40 years after settlers had first arrived in Central Valley, the lake disappeared. It dried up. It vanished. It was gone. And so that period is also important because it like in that Land Act time, it's this huge taking and this defining of an exclusive public. And that is what modern land and water claims are based on today. The Stanford Environmental Law Clinic recently passed an amicus brief to the Natural Water Resources Department saying, that's a really important context that many people who live here were not eligible for water rights, Indigenous people being, right up top. If our water system is first in time, first in right, why did that not recognize people who've been here before anyone? And the Yokut's territory, meanwhile, had been like pretty much this whole watershed. This is like showing where different tribes lived. And of course, they had freedom of mobility. By the time of 1920, the Tachi Yokuts, who were, a small remaining portion of people who had survived this period of genocide and poverty and kind of like homelessness, they founded the Santa Rosa Rancheria, which is about 3 square miles up here. Meanwhile, that cotton company that founded Corcoran, this whole area in orange is the land owned by them. So transitioning to the 1930s, just because that's an important period socially and also water-wise, points of note is that after the lake has been drained, they've used all the water that filled the biggest lake. I didn't even say this. The biggest freshwater lake west of the Mississippi River is the claim to fame that Tulare Lake holds. They were still growing, still wanted to expand, and so they started using groundwater. And then also I like this image because it shows kind of the marketing of California agriculture that draws a lot of people in at this point in time, kind of like late 1800s through the 1930s. Classic citrus, it's really sunny, it's really nice here. So The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck, if any of you read that for high school, is set in the Tulare Lake Basin. And it follows this family that flees the Dust Bowl Plains, also following kind of like poor farming environmental disaster and social repercussions of that. They see an ad for jobs picking citrus in California, pitch their hopes on that. They road trip out west and they end up here. Instead of finding that good future, they find what John Steinbeck calls the monster. James Baldwin, writing about that period in time from a later date, describes it well. The monster is, we were starving. People all over the country were starving. Yet here were several photographs of farmers somewhere in America slaughtering hogs or pouring milk onto the ground in order to force prices up or keep them up in order to protect their profits. I was much too young to know what to make of this beyond the obvious. People were being forced to starve and being driven to death for the sake of money. The physical infrastructure and like way that worked in the book is that there are these huge land parcels. People can't walk to see where job postings are. There's a limited media output. Like you don't know, there might be a job over here. I guess I'll drive over there. I have a dime, like I can't afford gas, so I really need that job. Playing up kind of like the scarcity mindset, fear of other, because they might compete with you for your job. And of course, very limited public access. In contrast, in the movie of The Grapes of Wrath, what I think is really interesting is every time the cinematic, team wants to show a moment when the family who's encountering all these hardships is like encountering something positive, they're framed around water. So they take a bath in a river that's still running, and that's a happy moment. Or the traveling preacher is living in an irrigation channel, and it's like water is the public commons that they have. It provides for them when no one else is going to do that, because the governments didn't have a lot of safety nets at this point. And so 1930s, I think it's also of note that like these themes continue to today. These people who are working on these farms and these labor conditions consistently have protested about poor work conditions, about lack of access to resources, and the lack of profit sharing in these operations. This one is from a couple years ago, but 1960s to Chavez too. And so, yeah, important period because a lot of people look to government, and government thinks pretty seriously at this time about how to respond to both the environmental and human catastrophes of economic insecurity, exploitation of cheap labor, but also, limits to growth in terms of agriculture. Is now a time period when we should look at like redistributing and sharing. And so the New Deal comes out of this, and so sort of. And the other important thing is that the government solution to this problem, which at the same time as all of these questions about economic stability are coming up, farmers, meanwhile, are saying, we are employing people. We're one of the main industries employing people today during this period of Great Depression. We're running out of water. They're still using all of their groundwater. The technology is also not quite good enough as it is today, to continue pulling. And so the government solution to like hit those two problems is this big period of dam building, big public works projects. And so this is a picture of the Frank Kern Canal, which built in the 1930s was the biggest public works project ever in the country's history. And it was the solution to provide jobs to people and cheap irrigation water to farmers. So they stopped pumping groundwater, but continue supplying jobs. And the environmental legacy of this is that it permanently altered the watershed because it tied two rivers together from two different subbasins, pumped them through a canal. This is the start of California's very complicated political and physical water infrastructure. And I'll just note the way they maintain this today is they dump herbicides into the water so that it can't grow plants in here, but that's what's being used to irrigate the food. And that is repeated again in the 1960s, but bigger. This is the Pat Edmund Brown California Aqueduct, which runs alongside I-5, built during that period of like highway, heavy power infrastructure, big water infrastructure. This is the closest vote in state history to build this water infrastructure. And it's very winner takes all. You can't undo this. It also came with a lot more benefits for farmers in terms of how many acres they could use the irrigation water for, enabling production on landscape that looked like this to grow orchards. And so the legacy of that, I think what's so ironic is that these projects were supposed to rein in on sustainable groundwater usage, but today the region uses more groundwater than ever. It's one of the fastest sinking regions in the world by National Geographic standards. And the ecological consequences have been devastating. Per the state's natural resources agency, like biodiversity book, less than 10% of native habitat remains here. And the hydrology today requires a lot of human interference and concentrated power, which is very difficult to influence as like a member of the public, but also as a city trying to change their policy, because it takes a lot of negotiating and understanding of a complicated bureaucracy to move all this water around. All the major rivers were dammed at various points in time. Meanwhile, the Santa Rosa Rancheria, as I said, first in time, first and right. The first people, their water source is something called the last chance ditch. So they say, first in time, last in rights. You see the water coming in from this. It's one of the few places in Google Maps when you zoom in where you see kind of a naturalized flow. You see where it wants to go, but doesn't. It gets routed over here. And that reduces the tribe's ability to like kind of plan their own water infrastructure because they don't control when the water's turned on and off. And when I talked to, I guess just an update as I called before I gave my talk to MIT, I called my contact, who's the cultural liaison, asked him kind of like, well, what's going on now? Like, what's the conversation? He had a couple questions he wanted me to like emphasize. The lake, after it came back in 2023, the state worked pretty quickly to pump it away. And so it's mostly gone now. And his question is like, they justified that by saying, this water is poisonous. Like, there's all these agricultural chemicals in it. And he says, so if it's so poisonous that it had to be drained, doesn't that make the land underneath it poisonous too? And if the land is toxic, like why are we using it to grow food? And why are we sending that food to the world? Because California feeds the world. Why are there not people who we can talk to who are, enforcing environmental regulations here? Like, why does that not seem to apply in this region? Who is doing that regulation? And what is kind of the cost of feeding the world? Just a few metrics is that, it's a big source of air pollution. It's a big source of greenhouse gas emissions, and a big source of water contamination. So troubling questions indeed. And, just ending this history chunk because it can be kind of a bummer. I was out there and I saw these murals and I thought these were pretty interesting. This is just north of where the Rancheria is, in a town called Lemoore. And at first I thought like, oh man, like these two walls, they're facing each other. They're like totally conflicting histories. Can there ever be coexistence and peace? And then I thought, yes, like I think I was looking at it wrong. In between the two of them, there is water, and water brings people together. And so given this context, the Tachi Yokut's tribe for the water of Paashi Tulare Lake to be protected, they also call for it to be made accessible to everyone. National park. That's really powerful. It's very generous, I think, given the history. Thinking about how water and the land, which had been the source of trauma, as history on first read is so divisive, like how it can start to be a source of healing for both people and for the planet. So briefly, consider their proposal, consider the park. I hope you can hear the birds because I thought that was pretty cool. This is from the lake in last summer, 2 years ago. A place to gather, a place to weave, and a place to dream. Ample literature supports the claim that parks are not just amenities, but they're essential public health measures. This obviously saw a lot of traction during the pandemic when people really flocked to outdoor spaces to have physical and mental health. But literature from public health, literature from medical journals, literature from planning sources, show meaningful and measurable health benefits from spending time outside, especially near water. Parks are also increasingly being seen as a form of climate infrastructure. So this is showing Sponge City, which is a big concept in Southeast Asia and China especially, where natural detention ponds and vegetation are being used to provide people with recreation and protection from stormwater because it absorbs excess flows. Parks build wealth for communities. They raise property values. They're an indicator for strong civic bodies because they provide public places for people to gather and do that hard work of democratic decision making. Thinking about a national park, one of the criteria for that is, is this a nationally significant place? I think Tachi easily meets this criteria. Very interesting history and historical arc of this is how this region, biggest lake west of the Mississippi River, densest settlement of Native American people. Very symbolic story, I think, of a lot of settlement history across the United States and in California in terms of the land acts and dispossession. And then kind of the rise of this massive economic agricultural industry is also very interesting. But it's also, it's the story about is this place that we chose to make better, and we did it collaboratively, and that is really moving and compelling. It's an optimistic approach to problems that usually shut people down. Climate change and racism, they're scary, they're uncomfortable, but here's a place that we chose to make better. Watershed restoration is climate adaptation. It's policy aligned with the 30 by 30 initiative about conserving private land or conserving natural lands, recognizing that they are important for human and environmental health. There's case studies around the world that we can look at for guidance here to national park projects that were led in partnership with Indigenous nations and also agricultural stakeholders. Restoration of the Everglades in Florida. Watershed was similarly highly interfered with, but they're trying to figure out how to restore the flow. A really big state collaborative project along with the National Park Service. And then removals of dams have gotten quite popular over the last few years in terms of them actually happening, but it has been a conversation that's been building for decades since the dams were first put up. And so advocating for the water to flow so that the ecosystem can flow as well. And yeah, the National Park Service is already doing this, or was up until this year, but I think the trend lines are strong. From Muir Woods, here's a little sign that says, everything on this sign is accurate, but incomplete. The facts aren't under construction, but the way we tell history is. And so trying to be more inclusive of this multi-ethnic, multi-racial, multi-religious, diverse, complex public that we have in the United States, trying to tell all the stories so that people can see their history reflected too. Indigenous leadership for the Barriers National Monument. This is one of the councils that runs this park. Restoration of native species in Yellowstone, releasing some of the bison back who were killed almost to the point of extinction during Manifest Destiny Western Settlement. And then this is the, I'm blanking on the name, something Sloss, I think the Sloss Furnaces in Birmingham, Alabama. Really big source of manufacturing pollution that disproportionately impacted, former slave cities and redlined areas of Alabama. Now being told is a story of this is no longer an industrial production. It was a really big place when it was, cool infrastructure, but it serves the community better today is something that's not putting pollutants into their environment. So honoring these industrial histories as American stories. And so for my thesis, what I did was I kind of tried to prove out the concept and think about how this document could be a useful resource for the tribe to use to try to accomplish their vision. If you want the national park, how are you going to get there? And so the first half was kind of structured on community engagement and thinking what the tribe could do to lead the conversation at this grassroots level to start building political support for the idea, because it's going to take a lot of people interested in this idea for it to ever happen. But it's not impossible. And so thinking about interest and power mapping, who has interest, who has power, how do you get those folks into the same room and starting to talk to each other, reflecting on the experience that just happened to the valley when the water came back, documenting that, what was interesting to people, what was scary, what was worked or didn't work about public response, and starting to think about like how people reacted to this big thing that just happened. So that can be worked into the visioning itself. Doing pop-up outreach because there's not a lot of places where people gather together in this community. And so like going where people are and trying to talk to them there, reaching like a definition of significance that is shared. Like what do you want to have for your vision? Like what are your keywords? As well as like your ecology goals? Like what are the goals hydrologically that we're trying to accomplish? So really being clear about what the park can and cannot do in terms of problem solving. And then I also drilled down a little bit on that idea of hydrology. And so like, this is a highly degraded habitat. The ecosystem has been really impacted by this legacy of water infrastructure change and intensive agricultural cultivation. And so if you want to meet the goals of having clean water for everyone, including wildlife, like you need to think about how to address water quality and water movement in a holistic way. And so one of the tribal members' ideas was, she had written her thesis about this too, which I thought was pretty cool, is that you can do that using a lot of the infrastructure that's already there. I mean, this is like designed to move water around the lake bed. Like that might be a way to start thinking about how we start to clean these areas that have had a lot of pesticide exposure and start to restore groundwater capabilities in land that has been subsided and compacted. And so I proposed from the natural flow to the current flow to like kind of a more restored flow, like the model the Everglades had used. And so trying to think about how to build out more areas that are connected areas for native habitats like wetlands, which we know start to restore some of the ecosystem functionality, and being strategic about how policy could support that. So some of the strategies were a biosphere, which is used by some national parks and some parks around the world in terms of different tiers, kind of conservation strategy. So the national park would be at the bottom of the watershed, but the lake is, but like also protecting the water quality of the rivers that flow into that, and having that be an area where there's some agreement in regional policy. Policies tried to think about who's in charge of implementation also, and the scale of where they're applicable. Thinking again about like holistic watershed, sustainable agriculture is really important. So that could be like a biosphere policy, is that, if you have a dairy, like instead of having a manure vat, like can you have like treated, constructed wetlands to treat that water before it goes back into the canals, so that people can trust that the water that's coming downstream from those is going to be a little bit cleaner than it would be otherwise. Daylighting areas where it runs through where possible, that can support like different types of crops like market gardens versus very intensive watered orchards planted out as maxed as you could go. Also opportunities here for indigenous foodways to serve as like an economic development practice. And so thinking about more inclusive economic growth while honoring the agricultural heritage. Thinking also about, we know the water comes sometimes and a lot of it comes really fast. Where can we store that when it happens so it's not putting communities at risk? So like designated certain areas to be kind of like these pop-up water storage cells, and focusing first and foremost on making sure those have clean soils, that there's not going to be these concerns about pollution afterwards. And also trying to design, like you can get your critical infrastructure elevated so that won't be as at risk in the case that it does get wet. And of that means there's more of a distributed storage capacity, less risk, more groundwater recharge, and more habitat benefits from that as well, because you have options for animals throughout the watershed to have spaces where they can go. Different conveyance systems. If you have these canals where water moves through really quickly, it goes really fast. And so in times when there's a lot of water flood, that's what can cause problems further downstream. Whereas if you have more of a naturalized area, it slows it down. You can also incorporate more like plants that help clean the water along the way as it goes. So providing habitat area as well. There's just a section detail of what that would look like with levees and island baffles, and creating then corridors for both land and aquatic migration, while also trying to increase water quality. Yeah, connected habitat is really important. So that's where land use planning, I think, really could play a good part, thinking about like where these greenways should go, where they would be of most benefit, where they make most sense ecologically, and designated that so that over time, as opportunities arise, you can start to build out these connected pieces of habitat. And then the national park itself. There is a flood detention area that I think would be a great starting point for the national park, as well as, I said there's like 10% of native habitat remaining. This is about the 10%. It's luckily like pretty concentrated together. And so with the high-speed rail coming in, and Interstate 5, there's good transportation access. Is where the water is meant to go during big water years anyways. And you can benefit from these different chunks of habitat restorations already taken place. So you can build on those assets and make your lake park, where the lake used to go, along its old southern shoreline. This just showing satellite imagery after the floods in 2023. Once they'd started to be pumped away, this is the area where water remains because that's where water is being stored. And centering tribal cultural revitalization in the park's design and programming would be really important, making sure that they are leading the conversation about how the story is told, particularly about them. That seems pretty obvious to say. And so, yeah, trying to be really community-led in the park's design, thinking also about how you can have good like buffering and screening of like different uses. Like if you have some chunks that are agricultural, like can you have like murals or art or other ways to kind of ensure that both can be compatible nearby. Transportation, a lot of the roads were closed. Transportation is a really big issue for folks out there. If you don't have a car, it is really hard to get around. I think there's one lift, but the high-speed rail is going to stop there. And so thinking about how you can build out those connections that people can get to town or around the park. And if you're working on infrastructure anyways, think about how you can also build out your green infrastructure capacity too, because it's very sunny there. And so it's a great place for solar. So in summary, thank you for listening. The park is a logical multi-benefit solution to many overlapping problems. Public engagement and strong coalitions are essential to make it real now more than ever. It seemed easier last year than it does this year, but the trends are strong. There's a lot of really great building conversation and partnerships between Indigenous nations and environmental organizations. The two have not always been linked. And so thinking about environmental justice and justice for the environment as kind of these entwined issues, I think is gaining more traction. And that is exciting. And under the Biden administration, it was really cool because we saw a lot more Native American leadership in high policy places than we had before. And so that's a goal people know to push for and reach now. Water rights and legal frameworks are a huge barrier, but I think that kind of addressing the demand can help, that consumers can have a voice there too. Incorporating rights of nature into those legal frameworks, as many lawyers are trying to start to do, is important. But also further research would be needed to think about, like, if this park went in California, are we not just thinking of offshore extractive agriculture to Mexico or other parts of the world? So trying to think about like global indigenous politics to think about how we can share and start to amend some of the damage that we have done as a species to the planet. So I ended my thesis on kind of like a speculative fiction piece. And so there was the story of like 30 years from now or so, the park pops up again. But this time the groundwork has been laid so that the valley is ready for it. And they're ready and they embrace it. Because conversations happened across the public with experts, led by the tribe, led by advocates. And it really centered the lived experience of people who were out there and holders of traditional ecological knowledge. And people got really excited and they made this park. And then I zoomed out just a little bit further. I also gave myself the sign that I wanted at that rest stop because I think that'd be great. But zoomed out just a little bit further, seven generation thinking being a concept of a lot of indigenous cultures, like 7 generations back, 7 generations forward. 7 generations forward, we might be on the moon. I don't really know, or somewhere in space, but looking down at California from above, some little person, I think there's still nature in the future. Maybe they're camping. But they say, hey, moon computer, what is that water body? And it pulls up some information. It says, it looks like you are looking at Lake Tulare Lake, Tachi. Here's some facts. How would you tell the story about it? So trying to invite people and implicate the readers who've just heard this. How do you make sense of this? And what do you want to see? Thank you for listening.